In our previous modules, we've looked at what does a web browser do? How does it display the information? We looked at how to create the basic web page and included some basic content. Now, the content that we looked at were things like headings and paragraph tags, and that is the meat and potatoes, if you would, the core elements of the content that we're going to display. However, how we group and organize that content is very important. We talked in our previous module about the startings of CSS, and we said that you can apply classes to tags, and we said that Google, for one, was very big in a report saying that, hey, this many percentage of websites were having a div tag that used a class that was heading or header or something like that. And they had this many websites had a div tag with a class of footer or foot or something like that. So the team that was responsible for putting together the HTML5 specification said, you know what? If a lot of people are already trying to create essentially their own header and footer tags and several other things like that, why don't we just create these organizational tags, and then designers and developers can use them, and then when we have a spider bot, whether it's from Google or an internal search engine or any place else, they get to use it and it gets to be an effective tool. So let's look at some organization. Now, right now we have the basics of that with the header and the footer in our sample page here. But now we want to look at some other things. Okay, so let's see how this is going to work. So I'm going to come over here to my template. You're going to notice I have my HTML tag, I have my head tag, I have my body. Inside my body, I have my header and footer, and then I have an HTML comment for main content goes here. Well, there's actually a main tag that we can use. If you look at the definition of the main tag, you'll notice that it is designed to be the main content area for the page where information is unique. That is, we're not going to put things like our header and footer in there because those things exist on every page on our website. And they should be the same or almost the same across the website. So instead, we're going to come in here, and in my case, it's line 17. Yours might be slightly different, but I'm just going to put the main tag. And you'll notice I put the closing main tag after my HTML comment. I can still leave that HTML comment there. So anything that's going to be unique to the web page, that's going to go inside of our main tag. And this is where the main content's going to be. I'm not going to put a sidebar. If I have a sidebar, that's going to be a different structure altogether. We'll see how to do that later on. So this is just going to be content. Now, if you want to think of it this way, think about it like if I have a web page and I'm talking about a news article, or I'm talking about a sporting event, or I'm talking about how to play a game or something like that. Okay? That page, the main content, that's what the people are looking for. That's all going inside the main. No one goes to a website and goes, oh, that's a really cool header. Okay? They want information, whether it's a video, audio clip, images, text, or some combination. That's where we're going to be putting this, okay? So that is our main tag. We're going to save this real quick. And notice this is still inside the template because this is something I'm setting up for every page. Come here, I'm going to reload. And when I reload, notice that the page does not change. Our main tag is strictly organizational. By default, it doesn't have any extra padding, or margins, no border, no background color, anything like that. Now, we can override those defaults and we can go and make changes in our CSS. But by default, it's not changing anything. And that's kind of actually important because it's not designed to change your page. It's designed just to be dropped in and let it work. And that means that you can drop it into existing web pages and not change how the web page works. That's really important. So if you notice that nothing changes, that's okay. That's what we want. All right, so let's look at some other organizational tags. And these are going to be page specific, so I'm not going to put them in my template. So I'm going to come up here and do File, Save As, and give it a new file name, in this case sample2.htm. Now obviously I can come in here and change my title, I probably would. Okay, So inside my main tag, I can put other organizational tags. And these are kind of important because of the way that we do web pages nowadays. You might think, well, what do you mean? Well, blogs have become very important over the years. And in a typical blog, and obviously there are differences, but in a typical blog, you might have, for example, an article, and then you have another article, you scroll down, you get another article, you scroll down a little further, you get a different article. And so there is actually an article tag. It typically goes inside of our main, like so. Okay, so you say, okay, well, there's my article tag. Now what? Well, the article tag is, once again, strictly organizational in its nature. So if I come over here to my browser window, and I change this to sample2.htm, notice that nothing shifts, nothing changes at all. We can make changes to the CSS and get a completely different style. But by default, that's not going to happen. And the whole reason for that is it is strictly organizational. Now, the article is great because if I have a web page that has a single article on it, I have article, and that helps me look for it. If, however, I have a web page that has, based off a blog or something like that, I have 3 or 4 articles on it, I can group and subsort those articles into different sections. This makes it very effective for a knowledge-based search engine to go in and say, oh, this isn't all about the same topic. There's subtopics in here. And maybe I need to see if I can find a link that will take me to a page that's specifically for that topic. And that way, if someone says, oh, I have a question about, and they find it on that page, they can link to the specific page, not the page that has a bunch of articles on it. And it just is all about trying to provide the best search results for the end user. You, as the web developer or web designer, have a key component in that in helping to group and organize things to make it easier for search engines to figure those things out. So while I will only have one main on a page, I can have multiple articles. And you can see this kind of like this. Each article would have its own beginning and ending tag. They're all contained within the main, and then each article individually will have its own separate sections. I can put whatever content I want inside those individual articles, and we're good. Now, each article might have its own title. They might be written by different people. For example, I co-write a couple of websites with multiple people, and so my article might be the first one that shows on the top of the page. The next article might be written by someone else. And then a third person, they write a new article. Those articles all get pushed down. So they become the top person, the second, and the third. So how do we manage that? Well, often we're going to have a little header section for each article. So I can come in here and in an article go, you know what? I'm going to have a header. You might think, well, wait a second, we've got a site header. And if you look just a little bit up, you can see, hey, there is a header there on lines 13 through 16, but now you're putting another header on line 19, and you are absolutely correct. You can have the header tag used multiple times on a web page. Typically once for the body of the main part of the web page, okay, not the main tag, but the main body. And then you can have it for each article. So how do I style that to make sure it's going to be accurate? Well, that's a great question if you start thinking about that, because in my styles.css, you'll notice I just have header. And so if I switch over to my browser, you can see where even though my second header has nothing, it's starting to look kind of like that first header. So here's how we fix that problem. So a good way to differentiate these different headers is to apply one or more classes. And I can easily do that. I'm going to come up to the top header, the one that's for the top of the page. I'm going to say class equals, and I'm going to say site header. Then in my styles.css, I'm going to say dot site dash header. Now this is going to be for my overall web page or website header. This is going to be used everywhere. not for my individual articles. Notice that my header that's inside my article does not have a class associated with it. Save that. If I reload my HTML document in my browser, notice that the page header is still shown the same because the class in the CSS document matches the class that was applied to the header tag, but my header tag for my article is not showing. So you notice header, especially inside the article, is strictly organizational, does not affect the design or the layout of my web page unless I change inside the CSS, which I can always do. All right, so what types of things would we put inside this header? Well, I'm going to have here my H1 tag. If you remember, your H1 tag is designed to be a heading tag. It's the main emphasis of the whole article. Okay, so using this as a title for an article makes a lot of sense. If I have multiple articles on a web page, well, think of that like your major points in your English outline. Okay, that's normal. Now, you might choose to focus just on that major point, and that's fine too if you only have one article on a web page. But either way, this whole idea works. You typically only want one H1 tag for an article. Your title is a great place to be there. So here I have an example article title, and this is inside my header. I'll then probably put something like a paragraph tag. I might put a date published. I might put other things. How I'm going to do this is strictly up to the design of the site. And I might do something. I might make little changes and say, hey, does this affect it? Do people care? Is this faster, slower, whatever? You might think, is it important to do these tests? Well, if you remember back to previous modules, we talked about how Amazon, they run over 100 tests a year on average, trying to figure out what's the best way that they can make their website. And they've been around for years and years. You know, in internet years, they're one of the old dinosaurs, essentially. Yet people don't think about that and how they're still constantly evolving and making those little changes. But they are. So I don't think there's any reason for you not to also be making those little tweaks and changes to see, hey, does this matter? Do people care about who the author is? Maybe want to have it more pronounced. If you go into a bookstore, and I know it's kind of old-fashioned, but if you go into a bookstore, you'll see in some books the author name is bigger than the title name. Well, that author is well known and is well respected, and people look for books written by that author. So they're going to take their name and they're going to put it, you know, big and bold. They're going to want to cover most of that book cover with their name because that's the important part. Whereas if you have a brand new author that no one's ever heard of and maybe they're not putting a lot of information behind it, then the title of the book, that's going to be more, you know, bold and more in place. So how that's going to work and what you're going to be doing, that all kind of depends upon, hey, what do we see here? Now, underneath my header, I can just leave that blank and just have my regular content below the article, or I can put in one or more sections. Let's just see real quick what that would look like. So I'm going to go back to my browser because I'm going to go to my lorem ipsum generator. I'm going to make a couple changes. I want to have some heading tags, that's those H1, H2, things like that. I'm going to go ahead and leave no word modifications, so no bold or italics, no list, and I'm going to show the HTML tags. Copy that, come over here, and I'm going to paste this in. And you can see how that was done. Remember, the pasting is pretty simple. I'm going to take out this H1 tag because we have the one H1 tag for this article. I'm going to save it, and if I come back to my sample, you can see what this looks like. Okay, that's all pretty good. Now, I'm going to make one minor change to my HTML page, and that is I'm going to add a section tag. And this is always an option. This is not a required tag. So typically our section tags are going to include another heading tag. So I'm going to start my section. Here's my H2 heading tag 2. And I come down here to where it ends. If I come back to my web page and reload, you'll notice there is 0 change. Once again, it's organizational. But what the section tag does is say, hey, here's a section of information I want to use. It's kind of important to what we're doing, so here's some info about it. What do you have to say about that? And so you can kind of look at it and say, oh, that's a good way to organize things and break things down into smaller sections. And that's just what it is. It's designed to break things down into smaller sections. You may have noticed there's a trend right now in search engines to try to jump you to the exact spot on a web page that your search term was searching for. It made it very quick and easy if I'm using a section for it to find that spot and jump you there. So this is just the idea of using a section tag. A section is a collection or subsection of an article. Now, I can put the entire article body in a section tag. I've seen people do that. I've seen people where they break up sections where each subheader and that content that relates with that subheading is in a section tag. However you choose to organize your data, you're going to want to be consistent and do it like that. Okay, so these are our major organizational tags. There's one more I want to display that's kind of a combination organizational and content tag, and that's the aside tag. Aside is ASIDE, and I've seen a lot of people misuse this tag. You might say, well, how can you misuse a tag? Well, that is, I'm going to use it in a way that's not designed to be used. Most commonly, I'll see this being used where people want to create a sidebar, that little section that goes off to the side of a web page. Well, that's not what the aside tag is for. An aside is to provide some additional information that's not required to know in order to read the article, but might provide just a little bit of extra information that might be useful. So, for example, let's say you have an article about a baseball game, and they put a little bit aside, okay, they want to talk about the pitcher. Now, they talked about the pitcher and what he's done inside the article for that game, but the aside might give a little bit of history about the pitcher. You know, pitcher John Smith just came up from the AA team. He's only been in the pros for the last 2 weeks. Has a little picture of him, maybe has some stats on him. Whatever you would do, that would be considered an aside. It provides additional information about the article, but it's not required information to make the article usable. So how would something like that work? Well, it's real easy. You have a piece of text, and I'm just going to borrow a little piece from here. And you paste it in like that. Okay? Obviously, if we had a real article, we would have a real aside information. Now, the good and bad about this is by default, if I come in here and I do this, notice that nothing really happens with it, okay? Because it is an organizational tag, it's going to be moved to a different block. It got a paragraph tag inside of it, but I don't really see anything, okay? So how would I use this? Well, typically I would worry about maybe pushing off to my right-hand side or my left-hand side, letting my other text kind of float around it, those types of things. So let's see how we would do that. Well, that's all going to be handled inside of my styles. So I'm going to create a section for my main content. And specify a side. And now I'm going to give it a width. And say, you know what, width is going to be limited to 25%. So it's 25% of my screen size, whatever screen size that is. Okay. Now I can make a little bit of changes. I'm going to show you why it's going to be important in just a second. So let's come back over here, go to my article. Notice that this is 25% of my page. Okay. So now we got this big block over here. We're going to fix that in just a second. Don't worry about it. And in doing so, 25%, if I resize my screen, notice that the aside section is also resizing with it. And it's going to resize down until it gets to some lower limit, okay? Well, that means that if I have it on like a mobile phone, this is going to cause a problem, okay? Because 25% of mobile phones can be really, really small. And maybe it's best if it's the full width for a mobile phone. There's a couple ways that I can work around this, and I have to make a decision, okay, what's the best way to work around it? One is to do a media query so that I have different sizes based upon what size my screen is. And another option is to use the min and max width. So let's see how we're going to do that. By default, I'm saying, hey, you know what? My width is supposed to be 25%. But I also have a min width, which by default is none. So by default, I can be squished up and not take any space at all. Well, I'm going to say, you know what? I want at least 250 pixels. Okay, so if I say that and reload this, you'll notice that about here, notice that as I get smaller on my screen, my aside isn't getting any smaller. Okay, so I've set up a minimum width. I'm going to be 25% unless it's going to be less than 250 pixels. If it's less than 250 pixels, I'm stopping. I'm not going to get any smaller. So that's min width. And try to figure out what that minimum width ought to be. That's kind of a challenge, and we have to kind of play with those numbers in some cases. That's also a reason why a lot of people do use those media queries to handle different size screens for like phones and tablets, etc. But let's keep on with this. We're going to talk about that section later. Let's keep on with this. Okay, so I have my min width. I can also put a max width in. And I'm just going to say 500 pixels just because. My aside, I typically want to let people know it's a little bit different, but not too much. So I'm going to set a border. So this border is going to be all the way around my aside. That way people know they don't have to kind of cross into it. They see it, they know it's separate. So I'm going to set my border all the way around. Remember, I have to set 3 things with a border. I have to set my style of my border. So we're going to go solid. I have to specify a color. Now, last time we said it was black, but since I'm not really trying to draw attention to this, I'm going to make something that's dark, but not black. So I'm going to say pound 555. That'll be a nice medium dark gray. And then I'm going to set 1 pixel. Reload, and you can now see how that border sets itself just apart a little bit. We might go, you know what, that's still a little bit dark. You know, maybe I want to make it a little bit less. That's fine. Do 777. That's getting better. Okay, so we'll play with that some. There's some other things I might want to do. Like, for example, I notice that it's kind of very sharp and edgy. I might want to put a little bit of rounding on my corners. So you can specify border dash radius. And I can set different corners. I'm just going to set it to be the same for everything. I'm going to set 5%. 5% is going to be 5% of my size. You notice that creates kind of a little bit of oblong because my width is wider than my height. So I might choose, you know what, instead of saying 5%, I could come in here and say maybe 10 pixels. And that gives me a more rounded instead of that oblong type of rounding. So I can come in and I can say, you know what, that's a little bit too much. That's not enough. I can kind of tweak that. You notice that my text is right up on the edge of that one border. That makes it a little bit harder to see. So I'm going to come in here and adjust my padding. I'm just going to specify 10 pixels. And remember, I might come in and say, you know what, this is too much. You know what, that is a little bit too much. And I don't need as much top and bottom. I got the paragraph. It's giving me my space. I just need it left and right. So what I'm going to do is say padding 3 pixels top and bottom, and then I'm just going to do 7 pixels left and right. So I can have padding be a single number, which is all 4 sides, 2 numbers, which is top and bottom and left and right, or 4 numbers, which starts at the top and then works clockwise around. So now that's a little bit better. It's easy to read my text. I've got my border, but it still works. All right, and notice that what we do is we create a rule, we fix one thing, we make sure it works. We create a rule, we fix one thing, we make sure it works. So this whole idea has been about, okay, I'm going to make this so people know they don't have to see this, but it's still nice to see. What can we do? Now, another thing we often will do is say, you know what, it's an aside. It's supposed to be kind of pushed off to the side so they can skip it. Right now, you kind of have to read it. It's in line. So I'm going to break that being in line and take it out of the normal flow of the web page. The way to do that is with the float command, and I'm going to say, you know what, float right. When I float right, notice that it takes it out of my page. My other content's now going to move around it, so I have that paragraph there. It's moving around it. And this can cause a real issue because maybe I need to stop it at some point. You'll notice I'm starting to break into where my footer is, and that's going to cause an issue. So we'll see how to fix that in just a second. But you'll notice right now that it now pushed off to my right-hand side. It's easy to see. It's easy to ignore if I want to ignore it. I can do other things with this. I can put a slight background color to it. I might say, you know what, that border's still a little bit, striking. So instead of doing 777, which is kind of a medium lighter gray, I might do 999, which is now moving into that light medium side. So I can kind of do some other things with it if I want to. But let's fix this issue with the float, where the float, because it takes us out of the flow of the web page, and that's what floats do. And I can float to my left, I can float to my right. It takes me out of the flow of my web page, but it's going to force everything up around it. And you can see how it brought that footer up, and in doing so, the footer kind of overlays on top of it. And that's not what we want. So in footer, I'm going to add a new rule. It's going to be clear, and I'm going to say clear both. So this is going to clear no matter whether there's a float to the left or a float to the right. We cannot float to the center. There is no float center, so just be aware of that. We only float to the left or to the right. And notice when I did that, it just kind of pushed it down so that it's after the aside. Now you notice that while it pushed it down, it only pushed it down a pixel, okay? It's just saying I'm afterwards. It's not saying by how much. So do keep that in mind. But you can notice here that it gets more if I have less space. If I have more space, it still puts that gap between my last paragraph and the footer. So that clear is pretty important to us. Now, even with the float being set to the right, notice that the text inside is still centered. Okay? So floating doesn't change my justification for my text. If I want to change that, I have a text align, and I can be center, left, right, or justify. Those are your typical values. Now, there are some other values, such as you can see end, okay? But typically we do center, which is going to be center aligned, justify, which means our left and right borders are the same, left, which is standard for languages that read left to right, and right, which is standard for languages that lead right to left. Okay, so I'm just going to say center so we can kind of see what that's going to look like. Now, I am going to give you a warning about center aligning text. Okay, center aligning text is more difficult to read. So don't use it if you're going to have something that's going to be on multiple lines, okay? Especially if it's going to be a full width of your page. Have it smaller, okay? Have it smaller. Have center alignment be like for a site title or maybe an article title. 1 or 2 lines, and maybe, especially if it's in an aside, you can go a little bit longer. Do not have large sections of text. The reason why is our human eye is designed to look to one side, depending upon if we read left to right or right to left. It's designed to look at that side and expect to find it. If we have to go and find and jump for each, it's very, very difficult for our eyes to read that. So do not text align center for large blocks of text. Keep it small. When we look at captions, that's a good example. An aside is a good example. Like I said, your article and site titles, those are good examples. Outside of that, avoid it if possible. Now, one other thing we want to talk about just about readability is if you notice my article is taking up the full width of my page, that's making it a bit difficult because my text goes all the way to the end, and so it's hard to see that first letter. It's hard to really read it. So let's see how we're going to fix it. It's a very easy fix, and this is going to be inside our main content rules as well. I'm actually going to do the main tag, and I'm going to specify padding. On the top and bottom, I'm going to specify 0. That's not really what I care about. What I care about is my left and right. And so I'm going to specify 15 pixels. When I reload this, notice that it brings in the text both the left and right side. But notice how much easier it is to read that text. Because now my text isn't pushed up against the edge of the browser. And whenever I have text that's pushed up against the edge of anything, edge of an image, edge of a border, edge of your browser window, that is difficult, and you don't want that, okay? So you want to have a little bit of space away from your edges. This was a very easy way to go and do it. Take my main tag, which is going to be everywhere, just give a little bit of padding. Now you don't have to, but that's one thing you can do. Let's look at how we would style that article header, make it stick out a little bit. The human eye is looking for contrast, things to make things stand out. So let's see how we would do that real quick. So I'm going to specify article header, and you might go, well, why are we doing article header? It's a compound selector, and that's exactly the reason why. If I look at my page, come up here, I have article header, where here I just have header. So if I just specified header, that's my site header, and it would get the rules as well as the article header. But if I specify article header, I don't have to add a new class. I'm only looking for headers that are inside of an article. So that's the reason we have a compound selector here. All right, so what are we going to do? Well, let's do a background color. And I'm just going to make it stand out just a little bit. So I'm going to say beige. Okay, that's a ready-made color that's built in. I don't have to do too much with that. And if I do that, I go, oh, okay, now I can kind of see where it's going, what it's doing. Okay. Now, inside this, I might say, you know what? I want to do some other things to make it stand out. Once again, because I have that now a border is created because I have a background color where there wasn't one, maybe it's going to make it harder to read that text. So I'm going to want to fix some of those things. So I'll just give a little bit of padding around everything, and that should be good as far as that goes. Now, I might not like that beige. If I come back here, you notice it's, okay, there's 5 pixels, it's fine, but it's also a little bit, is this really what I want, for a color? I can go in and make changes to this. Okay, so now it's a very light blue-gray. We'll see if that's going to work a little bit better for us. I'm going to specify article, header, and then my paragraph tag. And the reason for doing that is this is going to be where the author is listed. And you'll notice I have a lot of space around the author, and that's probably not the most important part of this, okay? I want that H1 tag to really stand out. So here I'm going to come in and say, you know what? Font size is 90%. My color, instead of being black, I'm going to make it a very dark gray, so it's just a little muted. It's not a lot, it's just a little muted. And I can come in here and do some other things if I want to. Okay, so notice that now it's not staying out quite as much. One of the big things I'll often do is change maybe the margins around it. Do I need to have this margin? I can always make a little adjustments like that. For my title, I often want to make this bigger. I want that to catch people's attention. So I would come in here and say article header H1. So now I'm only dealing with H1s. They're inside of a header. They're inside of an article. Okay. The more compounding tags I have, the more specific my selection is. And this becomes real important. This ability to select a tag specifically based upon its parents is known as CSS Selector Specificity. The more specific I have, the more I can dial into a specific tag. And just using tags gives me a certain score. It's a point score of 1 for every selector tag I have. So here I have a score of 3. And this becomes real important because sometimes I'll have 2 different CSS rule sets that can be applied. And CSS needs to know, well, which one takes precedence? Because I could have maybe a different font that's used or something like that. And I need to say, okay, which one am I going to use? Well, the solution, believe it or not, is by that specificity. And so if I give 1 point for every tag that's selected, that's great. If, however, I give 10 points for a class, remember I said classes were designed to allow you to apply to CSS rules, then it's like, oh, I'm going to use this one. This is the precedent. If I have a class and a tag, well, that's like 11, and then that's the one that's going to win. And so it's all a matter of, hey, who has the highest score? And that's the one that's going to win if there's a confusion as to which rule I should apply. All right, but for this one, there's no confusion. We're just going to do font size, and we're going to say 1.3M. Go back, and notice I actually went smaller. The default size for an H1 is more than 1.3 times the size of the base tag. So remember, it wasn't 1.3 times its size. It was 1.3 times the size of essentially what's your default font size. And so this is why we always go in and test things. Let's make this 2. And now you notice it's, okay, this is bigger. This is more like what we expect. I can make this 2.25, and I can say, you know what, my margin, top and bottom, it's only going to be 5 pixels and nothing on the side. So this way, our header doesn't take up too much space. Now, you will see in certain online locations and websites that, man, that header's big, has lots of space around it, and they want it to be sticking out all by itself. You almost got to scroll to see the article. Whether that's the right choice or not, I can't say. That's not my preference. I like something like this a little bit better. I think this works well. So you have to kind of go with what's the best option for you and based upon what your design specifications are. Now, if you're not a designer, you're a CS major, an IT major, the key things you want to work on is readability. And all these things that we've done have been, yes, design elements, but they're designed to make it more readable for your end user. No one's going to say, ooh, wow, this is pretty. You're going to win a design award for this. But if they're willing to read it and get the information that they need from it, you have succeeded. That's what we want to talk about. So in this module, we've looked at our organizational structures, how we organize information to make it easier to find things. We've talked about how do we style these organizational structures to make them easier to see and to use. And we talked about our readability. And so we've covered a lot of different information in this module, but now we can start to put together actual web pages that make a lot more sense. In our future modules, we'll start looking at things like how do we put in additional types of content like lists and images and things like that. So keep watching so we can keep moving forward with more advanced and better web pages.